pole's cantankerous racket, and now she was standing right in front of me, looking artfully disheveled, barefoot, in a vintage slip. I'd never met her before, and, going sheerly by her reputation, I was expecting someone approximating a feral child. Instead, as I say, she quietly welcomed me with a plate of grapes and invited me into her home. First, there was a tiny, dimly lit living room with no furniture in it. LPs and guitars strewn around the bare floor, and against one wall a small Buddhist shrine with burning candles. I don't think I'd ever knowingly met a Buddhist either. Norwegian Wood, this bird has flown, was playing softly on the crappy little stereo. And then there was the very long walk down a very short hallway to the bedroom. It couldn't have been more than 15 feet, but it just seemed to elongate as I walked down it, kind of like at the end of The Graduate, when Dustin Hoffman runs down the sidewalk toward the church. Eventually, I got to the door and opened it to find Kurt lying in a little bed in a little room, his back against the wall, facing the doorway, his shocking blue eyes laser beaming through the subdued lighting. His bare feet were sticking out past the bedsheets, and his toenails were painted a rosy hue. The smell of jasmine flowers wafted through the screen on the window above his head, and to this day, when I smell jasmine, it shoots me straight back to that moment. "Hi," he said. And two things struck me instantly, and I mean in an instant. The first was, oh wow, I know this guy. He wasn't some sort of rock and roll space alien. He was actually like a lot of the stoners I went to high school with. Hell, I was a stoner in high school. He was a little bit like me. A year or so later, I told Kurt about the moment we met, about how I instantly felt comfortable with him. And he said something like, "That's how I felt about you too. I was nervous about it, but the second you walked in the door, I thought, this is going to be okay." Because, as huge as Nirvana was, Kurt had been relatively unknown only a few short months before. A one-time small-town deadbeat, and now a guy whose articles he'd been reading for the past few years had flown out from New York City to interview him for a cover story in Rolling Stone. Kurt had been dreaming of this for most of his life. From when he was a little kid, he wanted to play in a rock band and be on the cover of magazines and stuff. As I said, this was a really big deal, for both of us. I just played it cool about the fact that he was doing an interview while lying in bed. Hey, maybe he often did interviews this way. And besides, it provided a nice bit of color. So I sat down on a little footstool next to him and started asking questions. I asked Kurt about what he was like as a kid, and he said something about being small for his age. And I stood up from my footstool, unfurled my wiry 5'6" frame, and said in a theatrically manly voice, "I don't know what you're talking about." And we exchanged smiles. And that was that. We understood each other. He said he was an artistic, sensitive kid. So was I. Okay, maybe not as artistic as Kurt was. And he said his parents were divorced by the time he was 10 years old, and he was melancholic ever since. Same here. And somehow I got to talking about Arlo Guthrie's The Motorcycle Song, and how I'd play the song on the family record player and run around the house pretending I was a motorcycle. And Kurt said, "I did that too." That Arlo Guthrie album, Alice's Restaurant, released in 1967, also features the 18-minute Alice's Restaurant Massacre, a quintessential classic of the 60s counterculture. It's funny to think that Kurt was familiar with it. We grew up on the same music that so many American kids did. Kiss, Cheap Trick, Queen, Black Sabbath, and so on. We even became stoners around the same age, too. It was kind of uncanny. So here I was, the bespectacled college boy Rolling Stone journalist from New York City, connecting with this guy from clear across the country, from a very different background, a rural high school dropout whose dad had worked counting logs in a lumber mill. Now, I'm not saying I was unique or special about any of this. Literally millions of people have a similar story and would have had a similar experience with Kurt if they'd met him. But it was amazing how much we had in common. We hit it off. A couple of years after Kurt passed, I asked Courtney why Kurt had connected with me so well.